All right, this is Knife Steel Nerds. I'm Laren Thomas. We are here with Sean Houston, knife maker. Hi, Sean.
Hey, how's it going, man?
So we're going to discuss some experiments I did recently on nitrogen knife steel. So nitrogen is the hot thing these days. Maybe not so much anymore. A few years ago, it seemed like there were a bunch of articles about nitrogen knife steels being the future. And I had an article and video a few weeks ago about Vancron, which is a high vanadium non-stainless nitrogen knife steel. And the big surprise with that study I did was that the edge retention wear resistance was much lower than other high vanadium steels from the nitrogen rather than carbon. So that the vanadium carbonitrides are softer than vanadium carbides. So we're going to pile on with more bad news about nitrogen steels, some good news, and we're going to talk about how high in hardness they can get.
I mean, you also pointed out some, like you said, there's some good news as well. There's some pretty cool features that you were able to kind of discover. I think this was really exciting, and I was really looking forward to doing this with you because after I read that article, I was like, oof, that's really cool. That works differently than I thought, and excited for people to learn.
Yeah, the article's not even out yet, but Sean has read it already because it was posted to Patreon. So you got to make sure you join the Knife Steel Nerds Patreon, right, Sean?
Yeah, dude, totally, man. I mean, because the thing is it supports really cool research like this because I think for a lot of us knife guys, we think, I'll figure it out. You know, I'll do some testing, I'll check stuff out. But when you can actually have somebody like yourself that can do all this research, that has a background and all this stuff to really start crushing all this information and then organize it in a way that we can all understand what some of the new results of things are, I think that's pretty exciting. And we would have never figured this stuff out if it wasn't for the Patreon supporters. So it's pretty cool.
Thank you, Patreon supporters. So, yeah, nitrogen it acts similarly to carbon. You know, just like they replaced the carbon dioxide in the Pepsi with nitrogen, we're replacing carbon with nitrogen in the steel, either partially or entirely, depending on what steel we're looking at. So those little nitrogen atoms, they go in between the iron atoms, which is the same thing carbon does. But when
Mm-hmm.
you quench it from high temperature and form your hard phase martensite, those little interstitial atoms, they increase the strength and hardness of the steel. So yeah, carbon and nitrogen work the same way.
Is that like the only other element that does that? Like inside the iron and the steel?
Yeah, it's the only one I know about, unless there was one in metallurgy school I didn't hear about. I mean, other elements can increase strength, like phosphorus is a pretty good strengthening element. But all the other major elements we use for strengthening steel are substitutional elements, meaning they replace iron atoms rather than go in between the iron atoms. Like hydrogen is also an interstitial element that is found in steel, but it's not used for strengthening.
Interesting. So it's unique then, this nitrogen, kind of carbon and nitrogen are pretty unique.
Yeah, and they behave surprisingly similarly in steel. Like carbon forms carbides, hard particles, nitrogen forms nitrides in the steel. So they're almost interchangeable. But I generated a chart a few years ago that I didn't really think too much about, but I found a study where they looked at nitrogen content versus hardness in steel and then plotted it out. And then I put that on the same plot as carbon versus hardness, and the nitrogen was like 2 or 3 points softer than the carbon. And I was like, oh well, this doesn't really mean that much. I mean, the nitrogen steels I know about, they all get reasonably hard, but this will matter, as we'll see a little later.
Interesting. That is funny how you found something that was the key to something, and because of the Rockwell hardness you were seeing with some of these materials, you were like, "Man, these guys don't know what you're talking about."
Yeah, the study must have been wrong a little bit. They didn't know how to use their Rockwell tester or something. Can't believe it got through peer review.
Which is surprising. You'd be surprised how many people don't know how to use a Rockwell tester, but that's a different subject.
Yeah. So we'll get into a couple steels now. So what I did in some of these experiments, and also some carpenter steel data, is I got a bunch of steels where they have a version with carbon and then a version with either nitrogen added or partially replaced. And then we can look at the resulting hardness that we get after heat treating and see how the nitrogen affects things. So we're first going to look at a couple steels where the nitrogen is a benefit. So the first one is BD1N. This is a carpenter steel. It's been used by Spyderco in recent years, and it's gotten some popularity as a so-called budget steel. Is anyone other than Spyderco using this stuff that you know, Sean?
There were some like kitchen companies, kitchen knife companies, not kitchen companies.
Uh
No, there
huh.
were some kitchen knife companies, and they were the ones that kind of kicked it off, actually, even before Spyderco, and they were using some of this stuff and sending knives to be manufactured overseas or whatnot using this material. And then
Because
Spyderco became
I thought
aware.
Sal told us that they were the ones that worked on BD1N.
They were the ones that worked on BD1, and
Mm.
then so it was a gift towards Sal because he had helped them with some knife steel stuff because carpenters decided they were going to get into the knife steel game. And this is per verbal with Sal at one of the knife shows. I believe the Eugene show. He was telling me this story. And
Mm.
as a gift to him, they're like, "Hey, we'll make a knife steel for you." And he wanted a steel that was like the Jingami steel. It was like a
Uh-huh.
Japanese stainless steel. And
Like
so
the
they
number
made that for
one or
him
the
and
number
called it.
three or something.
It's not quite clear. I'd have to ask him again, but I just remember Jingami. That was the name, like silver.
Mm. Mm.
Silver, I guess, is what Jin means in Japanese. But he wanted that steel made, and they made it for him, and they called it Blade Design 1. So BD1
Mm.
is kind of where the name came from. Then they had upgraded it with nitrogen, and then they didn't really keep Sal up to date with it because Carpenter is kind of like sometimes they're hot and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're super into knife steel stuff and then they go away. And then, oh,
Mm.
Carpenter came back and yeah, we're really into knife steels and we want to help out the knife community. And then they disappear and then they come back.
Yeah.
So he kind of got left out of the loop on that. And then eventually he was able to get some. And now we have BD1N from Spyderco.
Yeah, so BD1 is essentially a 440B type
Okay.
steel. It's on the low end for chromium. The 440 spec is 16 to 18 chromium, and BD1 has a target of 16. But I mean, otherwise, it's essentially just a 440 type stainless. So I've got a chart from Carpenter's own data where they show BD1N and BD1 versus austenitizing temperature. So I just plotted it out so it's easier to see. So this is with a cold treatment after quenching and then a 300-degree temper. A 300-degree temper is about as low as I ever recommend for most steels because that gives you a little more toughness and ductility versus as quenched or no tempering. But usually with similar hardness to as quenched, sometimes even a little bit higher. But the bottom line here is just with the nitrogen addition, you get a couple points more hardness for a given austenitizing temperature. So that's the temperature you heat it up to before quenching. And so normally when you austenitize higher, you put more carbon, or in this case, carbon and nitrogen in solution, so that when you quench, those little interstitial elements are there to increase your strength. And adding a little bit more nitrogen to the BD1 means that you get higher hardness after quenching. So it's all good news. And then I've got a chart showing BD1 carbon in solution versus temperature and BD1 carbon plus nitrogen in solution. And so we actually multiply by 12 divided by 14. So because those are the ratio of the atomic weights of the elements. So BD1N with the nitrogen, you have to add a little bit more nitrogen than you would carbon just because it's a little bit heavier element. And
The
then
Which one's a little bit heavier?
the nitrogen.
Okay.
So that's why you have to multiply it by a smaller ratio to get it consistent with the carbon.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I asked about that because the first time I saw that graph, I saw there you had the carbon plus, and then in parentheses, so 12 over 14. And then
Yeah.
I was like,
And the
what is
reason
that
why
then?
that's not simplified down to 6/7 is just because to make it clear that it's the atomic weight ratio.
Mm, okay, cool.
And then I plotted out the carbon plus nitrogen versus hardness, and you get a pretty linear trend. You get more carbon nitrogen in solution, you get higher hardness after heat treating. So it's all good news.
I mean, when you look at this, you're like, okay, add nitrogen to everything.
Yeah.
I want it in every Pepsi.
Yeah, and it's relatively easy for them to add it, at least in these kind of amounts. As nitrogen, it's hard to get it into liquid steel. It's not very soluble in liquid steel. So you add in gaseous nitrogen and it just floats on out of the steel. But in a small amount like this, they can pump in a little bit of nitrogen and it'll stay in there. And
Is there
it's
a simple explanation as to why or whatnot you could share with people?
the
Or
solubility. Somebody
yeah,
smarter than me would have to explain that. But different elements have different solubilities in different solutions. If you think about how much sugar you can stir into water until you can't stir in anymore. If you ask someone, well, why can't you stir in more sugar? You'd be like, I don't know. That's just the equilibrium value with the water.
fair enough.
So, yeah, maybe a fancy physicist or, a professor, they can explain that, but that person is not me.
It's fine. Get off topic, anyways.
Hmm. So then we have the question of why not just add more carbon instead of nitrogen. So you wanted more hardness, just like from the nitrogen, just add more carbon. So I did some fancy calculations in thermocalc, which is a modeling software pretty common in the metallurgy industry. So I added the same amount of carbon as you would have from the nitrogen and plotted out how much carbon in solution there would be. And adding that much carbon, it only barely bumps up your carbon in solution. When you plot it out, it almost looks like it didn't change at all, especially compared with the BD1N.
And just before we go any further, I just want to kind of touch on that modeling software. So basically, for those of you guys out there, Laren has access to this software where you put in a steel chemistry and it'll show you kind of what changes or whatnot happen at different temperatures or whatever you really want to look at, huh?
Yeah, it will predict equilibrium compositions of phases and amounts of phases. So that's a little bit complicated, but so it tells you if you take a steel of such and such composition, you heat it up to 1900 degrees and hold it there for infinity, you'll have this much carbide, you'll have this much carbon in solution, you'll have this much chromium in solution. And you can use that to predict various things. So, like, okay, with that much carbide and that much carbon in solution, I can probably get around 63 Rockwell as quenched, and I'll have around this much wear resistance. So it doesn't tell you, like, oh, this will make a great knife steel, but you can use other bits of knowledge that you have, other studies that you've done, like carbon versus hardness and things, and make some predictions about properties of steel. In this case, we're only making relative comparisons. So we see, like, oh, BD1N has more carbon and nitrogen in it than BD1. So we would probably expect it to have more hardness.
And I know what some people are thinking after you say all that. They're like, okay, sign me up. I'll take that stuff. But man, it's not one, it's not available. And before you get too bummed out about that, you really need the guru like like Laren over here to translate kind of what how that stuff works and what it's spitting out for you, because you can get really lost and maybe you added a wrong amount here, you're looking at the different part of the chart over here and you're making these wild conclusions about stuff, when really if you don't really have the background to interpret what that software was showing you, you get yourself in a lot of trouble. I could tell you guys that from firsthand experience.
Yeah, so I mean, nobody can afford the software. It's tens of thousands of dollars, if not six figures. You don't just sign up for an Adobe subscription for $30 a month or whatever. And then, yeah, it is difficult to use, and maybe some super enthusiasts would learn some things from it playing around with the software, but they'd also learn some things that aren't true because they don't understand how the software works or how to interpret it.
Yeah, it's useful having a metallurgist interpret this stuff, man. I mean, I would have been like completely lost if it. I remember coming to you about some details or whatnot. You're like, well, that's not true because this isn't this, and I'd be like, oh man, thank goodness I got the guru to guide me through.
I try. I mean, the software is difficult for anyone to use. So, I mean, I have metallurgist colleagues who don't even spend their time on any of this software because they either don't think it will do anything useful for them or they don't feel like learning it. Uh, so, anyway, on to the reason why adding carbon is not as effective at increasing strength as nitrogen, and that's because carbon is much more prone to forming carbides than nitrogen is to form nitrides. So if you add the 0.12 nitrogen, it'll basically all go in solution after heat treating, but the carbon is going to go towards forming more carbides, and not all of those new carbides are going to want to dissolve. And so not only do you get only a small bump in hardness, but you're also dropping your toughness by increasing the amount of carbide, and you're also getting less chromium in solution, so a decrease in corrosion resistance. Whereas adding the nitrogen, we actually see a small increase in corrosion resistance along with the increase in hardness. So we're like improving the steel in multiple ways versus the carbon addition, which is a series of trade offs.
Yeah, using that software, it really hits home here because, like, from that first graph you had there, where we're showing, like, okay, you could see by adding the nitrogen to the BD1N, you have that much more carbon nitrogen in solution, which is increasing hardness. So then you're like, well, you big dummy, why don't you just put more carbon in there, to equal that out? And then these next graphs you show using that software, it's really exciting because you could see even if you added the same amount of carbon to equal out the BD1N, the nitrogen, it doesn't increase how much is in solution, and then it drops chromium in solution. So it's like, oh my goodness, look at that. Mysteries unveiled.
Yeah, and earlier I said BD1 is basically a 440 series stainless. So 440A, B, and C show this same effect. So those are the same steel with 17% chromium. And then 440A has zero point 0.7 carbon, 440B is around 0.85, and 440C is around 1.05. And so as you go up in carbon, the potential hardness of those steels goes up, but the corrosion resistance and toughness goes down. So yeah, if you want high wear resistance and high-ish hardness, 440C is the choice, but its corrosion resistance is not as good as 440A. So the nitrogen in this case with BD1 and BD1N, it's kind of like, oh, we just make everything better almost.
Wow. So I mean, so you could almost mitigate some of the effects for 440C if you added just a touch of nitrogen, like they do with the BD1N.
Yeah, I mean that's what BD1N is basically, just with a little bit lower chromium than 440C.
Nice. It's pretty cool, man.
So we're gonna move on to Nitro-B, which is a steel
Ooh.
made by Buderus. This steel isn't used in that many knives. It's pretty new, so it's probably seeing some use under different names. And this is identical to a very common German stainless, which goes under some really boring, hard to remember names. So 1.4116 or X50CR15 MoV. It's 50 points of carbon, 15 chrome, a little bit of moly and vanadium. And Nitro-B takes that same steel but adds about zero point 0.1 or zero point 0.15 nitrogen to it.
And then the nitro cut is a little bit different, right? I believe there's a website that sells both of these steels, and it looks like the composition is similar. But you've pointed out to me that that's different.
Yeah, Nitro Cut is a little bit different, enough to be significant where I wouldn't say, oh, this hardening curve I have for Nitro-B would play out exactly the same in Nitro Cut, but they definitely work under similar principles and are a variant of one another. This seems to be a popular direction for some of these steel companies recently in Europe, is that they're doing modifications of the 4116 with different carbon, nitrogen, chrome, moly amounts. So for whatever reason, that's a direction a lot of them are going into. But if you compare the hardness of Nitro-B with the hardness of the 4116, again, we see the same thing, that adding that little bit extra nitrogen means that we get more hardness for a given austenitizing temperature up to a certain point. So at 2000 degrees, the Nitro-B hardness peaks at around 63 Rockwell. And then after that, if we increase the austenitizing temperature, the hardness goes down. And so this is something that's not discussed that much, even among knife makers or heat treaters. Definitely not, with the average knife buyer. But this is an important part of steel heat treating. That if you are using a temperature above this peak hardness, you are getting too much retained austenite, and it's going to make the properties of the steel pretty terrible. When we heat up the steel hot, it's called that austenitizing temperature because we form a steel phase called austenite. When we quench rapidly, it transforms to a phase called martensite. Retained austenite is when that high temperature phase austenite is not transforming to martensite. And so if we get too much carbon nitrogen alloy in solution, that austenite is too stable and it doesn't want to transform to martensite. And using cryo will transform more of that austenite. But in this case, I used cryo and we still reached a point where we couldn't transform all of the austenite to martensite.
That's a really good point to bring up, my man, because I think people, since they're so hyper focused on Rockwell hardness, they would look at this and they would say, going past 2000, well, I'm still good to go because I'm trying to hit 62 Rockwell and I'm still 62 Rockwell. So that should be the same as the 62 Rockwell under 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. But as you're pointing out, there's a different microstructure there, and that's going to have a real negative effect on the performance of that knife.
Yeah, and that's something Sean and I have seen together even in our big Catra study we did a while back. We had a Rex 121 knife that I just could not sharpen. Well, Sean also struggled to sharpen it.
Yeah.
Uh, the thing would not get sharp. We would get a burr, and then we'd take off the burr, and it would just leave a ragged, horrible edge. It felt kind of like the burr wouldn't come off. Though I'm not exactly sure what's happening. Maybe the burr would come off and just leave a bad edge
It would. So what
after.
was going on in my experience? What was happening to me was I would take the burr off and the edge would come off with it. And the
Mm.
sharpest I can get the thing. And before anybody judges us, one of the big we're kind of handicapping ourselves here because the test requires a low edge angle at 15 degrees per side, and then it also requires a low grit finish. So it's not like we could just polish it up, which is
Hmm.
what a lot of sharpeners will do. Like a professional sharpener, since you run into all these different steels you have to sharpen, you're not a metallurgist, you're not working on these knives to fix them. Your job is just to make them sharp. So you would go up higher and polish to fix this problem, but we didn't have that luxury because it has to be tested the same as everything else. And so I would take the burr off and the edge would come off with it. And so essentially, the sharpest I could get that thing was, I think, 175 grams on the best tester. And we kind of have that sharpness range that we're looking for on the for the capture testing to start the test. So we can't just use something that is necessarily starting duller.
Yeah. Yeah, that affects the whole rest of the test, obviously. If it starts out dull, then the edge retention is not going to be as good.
Hmm.
Now, we were able to get really high edge retention with that steel, even though the sharpness was not getting up there as well, just because the steel was so wear resistant. And a lot of people will blame difficulty in sharpening on the steel being highly wear resistant. Like, oh, Rex 121, that's as wear resistant as steel gets. But removing material, grinding away material was not the difficult part. It was just like the burr would not come off and leave a clean edge.
Yeah, and
So
in
we,
our defense, for
yeah,
like it not being difficult to grind, we were using CBN. I think for
yeah,
also for some people, a sharpening stone's a sharpening stone. Don't tell me all that nerd stuff about abrasive. But if you're compounding that issue too, if you're using a soft abrasive that's not sharpening all the features inside the steel.
yeah. So what we ended up doing is we just heat treated a whole new blade using a different heat treatment, where we attempted to minimize the retained austenite, and then it sharpened up beautifully.
Yeah, that was amazing.
So a lot of times when people blame the steel on difficulty in sharpening, it is not the steel; it's in fact heat treatment.
Yeah, which is difficult because you can't see it, smell it, or touch it.
Yeah. Well, and it's difficult to have some kind of quantitative test of like, difficulty in sharpening. Like how would you even test for that? You know.
Yeah, exactly. You could have somebody that's just bad at sharpening. No one wants to admit they're bad at something. I don't want to admit I'm bad at something. And having that be the problem, I'm not experiencing what's going on. It's this other boogeyman of bad heat treatment that's making it not work. When really it's just you didn't make a burr, or you're not using the right stone, or you just don't know what you're doing. So
Well, this
it's
is good.
difficult
All
to.
the bad sharpeners out there, they can blame the heat treatment. And
Exactly. Yeah, I'm gonna start doing it now.
okay, so we got sidetracked a little bit, but Yeah, so the Nitro-B, it gets more hardness. You can see in these curves that the 4116, it tops out in hardness, and no matter how much hotter you heat the steel, it won't get any harder. Because we dissolved all the carbide, all 0.5% carbon is in solution, and it's just not going to get to any higher level of hardness. 4116 will peak in hardness if you're not using cryo. So, it probably wouldn't reach this 62 Rockwell that I'm seeing, but instead would be more like 58, 59, and we'd be austenitizing, I don't know, like around 1900 or something. I did the math on this. I don't remember what the result was to
Which is
estimate where that would be. But
because this is really cool. Because when I see this, this is a steel that I don't think most people think can get to this levels of hardness. I think that for the most part, people when they see this steel, this 1.4116, they think, oh, maxes out like 57,
mhm.
59. You need more carbon. That's why it's not doing it. And then you're showing here, if you do the cryo with the right austenitizing temperature, I mean, we're 62. It's not chump change for hardness.
Yeah, part of the issue is the expensive steels get the careful heat treating. The high end companies using higher end heat treating with cryo, and they're trying to dial things in versus the inexpensive knives where if it's 58 Rockwell, no one cares.
Hmm.
The other issue is if we're dissolving all of the carbide out of the steel, putting everything in solution, there are no carbides left to pin grain boundaries, which means that grain growth is very rapid, especially at these temperatures we're looking at, like 2050, 2100. Grain growth is pretty fast up there. So you'd be blowing up your grain size and having very brittle steel. So this isn't necessarily a good idea, but there are steels that are not known for being particularly high in hardness that can go to much higher levels than we see in some production knives.
Mm, yeah, fair point.
So anyway, we can probably move on to LC200N. Now you might think that LC200N is a big 180 from these boring 4116 and Nitro-B steels, but what many people do not realize is LC200N is the boring steel 4116, but with some of the carbon replaced with nitrogen. That's what the whole steel is about. That's all it is.
And that steel also, Alpha Knife Supply sells it under a different name.
Yeah, it's sold under Z Finite, and the original version of the steel is Chronodor 30, which is what I knew it as before it was being used in knives as LC200N. So Chronodor 30, that's if you want to prove your old school status, you can call it Chronodor 30 instead. Uh, but yeah, it was developed in Germany. It uses a special process to get an extra nitrogen. So those other steels, they max out around zero point 0.1 or 0.15 nitrogen, but they use a technology called pressurized ESR so that they can get more nitrogen into the liquid steel using high pressure.
Yeah, because this stuff seems like it has a freakish amount of nitrogen compared to these other ones, huh?
Yeah, so it's difficult to get that much nitrogen in there. So 0.4% around there for LC200N. And
I mean,
so,
everything we've seen so far says nitrogen's doing some good work. So mo nitrogen, mo better.
yeah, Yeah, and then so I heat treated the steel. I compared it with the Nitro-B and the LC200N. It maxed out around 61, where the
What?
Nitro-B could get up to 63. Uh, so I'm like, well, what's going on? Because in the past, I knew LC200N, and later we're going to discuss Vanax, would peak around 61 Rockwell. But I always blame that on the fact that they have high chromium in solution, which also drops the martensite start temperature and makes you have more retained austenite. And that's what gives them more corrosion resistance is all that chromium in solution. But Nitro-B has just as much chromium in solution as LC200N, but it's getting 2 points harder. So I used
Well,
thermocalc again and plotted out the carbon plus nitrogen, and the LC200N is getting just as much carbon nitrogen in solution as the Nitro-B. It's just the nitrogen is not raising the hardness as much as a higher ratio of carbon would.
that's crazy, man. Yeah, because I remember too. Like, because I mean, first off, the LC200 is like crazy rust resistant, right? Almost like
Mm-hmm.
rust proof. I mean, nothing's like rust proof, but I mean, for all intents and purposes, this stuff is like crushing it out in the field with people that are doing like fishing and stuff like that. And and saltwater diving and things. I mean, it's holding up insane for a steel that can actually hold an edge. And so I remember learning about this stuff and heat treating it, and why can't I get this stuff harder? I think the peak hardness I was ever able to get was like 62 something from the first temper, and then dropped it down to like 61 and a half for the final temper. That was the max hardness I could ever get this stuff to. And I was like, man, what's going on? Why doesn't stuff get crazy hard? And I thought the explanation in the past was pretty solid that, okay, well, we have so much chromium in solution that we're limiting that hardness. And so I was like, well, dang it. It's just a huge trade off for all of that corrosion resistance, all that chromium in solution. But from this work that you've done here, that's not the case. That's very interesting.
Yeah, well, the chromium solution is still part of it. I mean, Nitro-B gets to 63, not 64, 65.
Okay.
Uh, but, the Nitro-B, it might have similar corrosion resistance to LC200N because it's got the same chrome, moly, and solution. Now, it has more carbon, which can have some complicating effects versus LC200N, but it's definitely an interesting test that could be done. Because the matrix composition, the chrome, moly, and solution is the same, but it gets a couple points harder. So the Nitro-B would be an interesting one to look at in terms of corrosion resistance. So one of these days I might do a side-by-side salt spray test between the two steels. I think it would be very interesting.
And then also, I mean, the crazy thing about that LC200N is just how fine the carbonitride structure is.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy. It's crazy how fine structured that was. With the 1.4116, you had a
Mm-hmm.
micrograph
Catchy
of
name.
that. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's a it's a tongue twister, which is what the Nitro-B is based off of, which is what the added nitrogen. The carbide structure of that stuff was just horrific looking. Like it was like the giant island carbide you had that almost took up the whole screen in
Yeah.
the 42 micrographs article.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that one I'm not sure if that is a limitation of the steel or not, because most of the steel would be fine. But then there were just these occasional massive carbides. So I also need to do a micrograph of the Nitro-B, which I haven't done yet. So, if we do a deeper analysis on the Nitro-B, that'll be part of it, is testing its toughness and looking at its microstructure. Because the 4116, those giant carbides will drop its toughness a bunch. So when I tested its toughness, it was, as bad as high carbide steels. So yeah, that'll be interesting if we get around to that, is the toughness of the Nitro-B and its corrosion resistance compared with LC200N. But it's got some promise.
Yeah, because I remember when you took that micrograph of the BD1N, I was thinking like, because as a sharpener, I like to like tell myself like, oh, I could feel the microstructure at the edge and all this stuff. And when I saw the structure of the BD1N, I was like, that's a lot chunkier than I thought I was feeling at the edge. And so that has that nitrogen addition, and I, I guess we don't have a micrograph of BD1 to compare if the nitrogen helped in some way as far as for the microstructure. But I think in a conversation we had, you were saying this 1.4116, maybe how it's being processed from after being cast or whatnot could maybe make the difference in that final microstructure, not just the heat treatment.
Yeah, well, we know that like Sandvik and Udahome, for example, with their razor blade steels, AEBL 13C26, 14C28N, their microstructures are impeccable. But you can find micrographs in the literature of X65CR13 steels, which are generic steels of the same composition, where they will have some chunky carbides in them. So Udahome and Sandvik, they've got some patents from the 70s where they really dialed in their processing, the hot rolling temperatures and the annealing process, etc., where they optimize for fine carbides, for good toughness and for high sharpness in razors and everything. So I have to think that the 4116 could be better than what I got in this particular sample. Maybe the steel company was having a bad day, or maybe they need to optimize their process more. It's hard to say.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's definitely an area where I think more research and stuff like that could be done, huh?
Yeah, yeah, we'll add it to the list of all the things I'll never get to. But All right, so let's move on to Vanax and Elmax. So again, these are two steels where I think people don't really connect them in their minds. They're both Udahome grades, so you'd think they would, but these are essentially the same steel. But Vanax replaces a bunch of the carbon with nitrogen. They both got 18% chrome, 1% moly, and around 3 to 3.5% vanadium. So basically the same steel, but one has a bunch of nitrogen in it. So again, we have the case where the Elmax, the carbon version, gets much harder. So I heat treated it up to nearly 64. It might be able to get to 64. I was just doing a simple set of heat treatments. I wasn't really trying to optimize for anything. But again, the Vanax, it peaked out around 61 and a half, and then it drops down. So in this case, the chromium in solution is definitely a factor. So Lmax, despite having the same chromium at 18%, much less of that is in solution, which again, that means less retained austenite in the Lmax, and it can get to higher hardness. But then we also have the nitrogen factor again, where Vanax gets a lot of its hardness from nitrogen. So that plus the high chromium in solution means that it peaks in hardness at a much lower point than the Lmax does.
Now the Vanax, it basically tested the best in corrosion resistance compared to all the other steels that were tested for
Well, Vanax and
corrosion.
LC200N, I couldn't get any rust spots on them in my saltwater testing. So MagnaCut, if I ran 4 or 5 specimens, I might get one that had a little rust spot on it. But for Vanax and LC200N, I never got any rust spots on them. So yeah, Vanax, the corrosion resistance is really high, just like LC200N, and so that's the advantage that it's giving you versus Lmax, even though the Lmax can get to higher levels of hardness. But yeah, so seemingly either because the proportion of nitrogen to carbon is a little bit lower in solution with Vanax versus LC200N, so more carbon, less nitrogen, but it also has more carbonitrides in it. So I don't know if it gets a half point harder than LC200N because of all the extra particles in there, or because it has a higher ratio of carbon and nitrogen, or some combination of those two. But again, we've got a high nitrogen steel with high corrosion resistance, and it reaches 61, maybe 62, maybe. All right, one more example. We're going to compare Vancron and CPM-10V. So again, two steels that aren't compared that often, but they're essentially the same thing, but one has a bunch of the carbon replaced with nitrogen, which is, of course, the Vancron. So the Vancron, it austenitizes from a much lower temperature. The same thing we saw with LC200N and BD1N. But it peaks at around 69 Rockwell as quenched with cryo, just like the CPM-10V does, even though the Vancron has a bunch of nitrogen. So what's going on with this one? Well, this steel is not designed to have nitrogen in solution. The nitrogen is not added for hardness. It is added to form a vanadium carbonitride rather than a vanadium carbide. So the hard particles are made up of carbon and nitrogen instead of just carbon. And that's added for a thing called adhesive wear. We talked more about this in my other article video. So almost none of the nitrogen is left to be in solution. It's like 0.03% or something, basically zero. So because it gets its hardness from carbon, it gets just as hard as the carbon version CPM-10V.
I really like the Vancron, man. The the edge characteristics on this stuff is really exciting, and I want to do some more testing on this stuff at the edge and make a video.
Yeah, you got to refute my study with some
That's
hardware.
right. How dare you? How dare you talk Bambi about the Vancron?
But yeah, its microstructure is very fine. Its toughness is a little better than the CPM-10V. So it's got some positive characteristics, but the wear resistance is quite a bit lower than 10V and K390 and Vanatus 8, and that was surprising to me. So you can go watch that other video to learn more about that.
That was surprising, yeah, because I remember asking you like a couple years ago, as far as like, well, what is the hardness difference between like vanadium nitride and vanadium carbide, vanadium carbonitride, stuff like that, and we didn't have kind of testing like this to see differences between that kind of stuff. You could just pull up all this different random literature that just had these like ranges of hardnesses because of these different factors that maybe weren't relevant to what's actually happening in the edges and stuff. And so to finally get this kind of testing, thanks to guys like Malachi that sent in This steel's insanely expensive, so that wasn't chump change for Malachi to break off some of those pieces and send them for the capture testing. So
Yeah,
kudos to
Trupa
him.
Knives will give a link to Malachi. Oh, shout
Yeah,
out to Malachi.
shout out to Malachi for sure, because this stuff is insanely expensive. And wow, that was just crazy to see that like the vanadium carbonitride, it doesn't really match vanadium carbide as far as for hardness and wear resistance. But
Yeah, so I think we're about done crapping on nitrogen steels for now. So I think, I was surprised by this limitation that nitrogen in solution does not get you to the same levels of hardness, because I did not realize this, despite the chart that I made myself a few years ago and put on my own website. It was not a connection I had really made. So the nitrogen is limiting your potential hardness. But nitrogen has its uses. We saw the BD1N, the Nitro-B. It's improving the overall properties of the steel, giving you a little more hardness and corrosion resistance. And something we didn't discuss is there's a bunch of powder metallurgy stainless steels that have around 0.2%, including MagnaCut, the steel that I designed. So it's not like nitrogen doesn't have any utility. But in those powder metallurgy stainlesses, it's not used to directly boost hardness. The nitrogen isn't going into solution. It's used for other more difficult to explain reasons. I'd have to do a separate video or article discussing the reasons why that's in there. But yeah, so nitrogen, it can be good in certain cases for specific uses, but you can't just add in more nitrogen into a steel and bam, it's better. It's a little more complicated.
yeah, and I mean, just because those vanadium carbonitrates are softer, it looked like from the capture testing with the LC200N and the 14C28, it looked like chromium carbonitrides were a little bit harder than chromium carbides. So it's not necessarily just nitrogen's always making stuff softer, huh?
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that in, Sean. Well,
Yeah.
you gotta sell those knives.
The steel, I mean, it's really cool, these different nuances or whatnot. And I don't want anyone to get the takeaway here that nitrogen, nitrogen bad.
Mhm.
When they get a chance to experience some of these knives and sharpen them up for themselves, I mean, you may be surprised.
Well, thanks for joining me, Sean. This was a good discussion.
Yeah, good stuff, man.
Until next time, go sign up for my Patreon. More money for me, please.
Oh my god, it goes towards research. It's helping actually get us good content and real
Yeah, I
breakthroughs in the
don't
knife
use the
community.
Patreon money for buying my Nitro Pepsi. This is perfectly innocent. The Patreon money goes to steel and testing and equipment and blah, blah, blah. It's very expensive, okay?
Yeah. And thanks to the Patreon supporters, we get really cool breakthroughs on stuff like this, and I can't wait for the next one.
All right, bye, Sean.
Later, man.
We're going to try a Nitro Pepsi. So nitrogen is so popular, even Pepsi is now on the bandwagon. So they have replaced the carbon dioxide with nitrogen, which gives it smaller bubbles, smoother taste, it says. Oh, we will find
Everything's
out.
smaller with nitrogen. You gotta love nitrogen. Okay, so there's a special way, Laren, we have to actually use these. It's
Yep,
not like
I
a
can
normal
read
soda where you
instructions. Yeah.
I, I know you can, but you got to pop the top and then instantly flip it upside down and put it into a cup. You don't really drink it out of the can.
All right, I'm ready. We're going to
So,
do some ASMR here.
pop the top. Don't get it on your computer.
Oh,
Turn
it's
it
going
upside down.
everywhere.
Yeah,
Oh, it's
upside
everywhere.
down in the cup. Use that nitrogen fizz.
Oh, I made a huge mess.
Yeah,
This was
I
a
told you.
mistake.
I tried to warn you there, Mister Instructions. And then what I kind of do is I'll throttle the tab a little bit and try to get more of that nitrogen in there. And then here's the key too. Don't open it all the way when it's upside down. Once you got most of that nitrogen fizz out, turn it right side back up, pop the top like that, and then pour the rest in. Otherwise,
Too
it's going to
late.
explode.
I
Well,
got to go get a paper towel. I'll be back.
yeah. You have to drink it immediately. Yeah, the only thing you're really going for is that smooth, frothy, creamy head that's on this
No, it's
Pepsi.
already
So
gone. Already gone.
Oh, that's the best part. And if you don't get that, you don't get the good part because
It
the
already
only
tastes a
thing,
little flat.
yeah, I was gonna say the only thing I didn't want to spoil it to you, but the only thing that nitrogen really brings to the table is it makes your soda taste flat.
Yeah. Well, it tastes kind of oddly sweet. I guess it's the same flavor as flat soda though. Like it starts to taste too sweet. It doesn't have any bite anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you wanted to mimic this, all you would do is just shake up a 2 liter, then leave it in the fridge for like 2 weeks or something with the lid off.
All right. Well, we solved this one. Nitrogen sucks. But
Yeah, I mean it was only good if you do it a certain. So in a lot of ways, it kind of what parallels kind of what we're going to talk about, huh? I guess there's some ways to make it good and
it's
uh,
real exciting. Smaller bubbles,
smaller bubbles, smaller
smoother taste,
carbonitrides, smoother
but then it
taste.
it falls flat.